What's that? They'll log it in Hillcrest?
Copy.
You'll catch a ride?
I'll wait for my unit.
All right, stay cool.
There is a moment that happens when authority meets resistance. A flashpoint where the badge, the uniform, and the assumed power suddenly become meaningless. It happens more often than most people realize, and when it does, the results can be explosive. What you are about to witness are 3 separate incidents where officers who believed their word was law discovered they were catastrophically wrong. These are not scripted dramas or Hollywood recreations. These are real confrontations captured on camera where the tables turned in ways nobody expected. Imagine standing your ground against someone who could arrest you, detain you, or worse, all while knowing you are completely within your rights. Imagine watching an officer realize in real time that their threats carry no weight, that their intimidation tactics have failed, that someone above them in the chain of command is about to undercut everything they just said. This is what accountability looks like when it actually happens. It is rare, it is satisfying, and it reveals something profound about the nature of power in America. If stories like this fascinate you, if you believe that understanding your rights matters, then stay with me until the very end. What unfolds in these 3 incidents will change how you think about every interaction between citizens and those who wear the badge. Trust me when I say the final confrontation involves a 5-hour detention that will leave you speechless. Let us begin with a morning in April 2023 in the city of Baltimore, Maryland. The federal complex on Hanover Street sits like a fortress in the heart of downtown Baltimore. Its glass and concrete facade reflects the gray morning sky, and the American flag snaps sharply in the cold spring wind. This is where the machinery of federal government grinds forward each day, where thousands of employees swipe their badges and disappear into the bureaucratic labyrinth within. To most people walking past, this building represents untouchable authority. To Marcus Webb, it represents something else entirely, an opportunity to test whether constitutional rights actually mean anything in modern America. Marcus operates a YouTube channel dedicated to what practitioners call First Amendment auditing. The concept is straightforward in theory, but controversial in practice. Citizens enter public spaces, record their surroundings, and document how government employees and law enforcement respond. The goal is educational. The results are often confrontational. Marcus has been doing this for nearly 4 years now, and he has learned to expect hostility. What he did not expect on this particular Tuesday morning was just how quickly that hostility would arrive. The lobby of the Federal Services Building is an expanse of polished marble floors and fluorescent lighting. Sound echoes strangely here, footsteps multiplying into a constant background rhythm. Security guards man the entrance checkpoint, their navy blue uniforms crisp and their expressions carefully neutral. Marcus passed through this checkpoint without incident. He placed his camera bag on the conveyor belt, walked through the metal detector, collected his belongings, and proceeded into the public areas of the building. Everything by the book, everything legal. He positioned himself near a seating area in the main corridor, his camera held at chest level, lens pointed toward the general flow of foot traffic. He was careful not to film specific individuals' faces, careful not to block walkways, careful not to create any genuine disruption. He had done this dozens of times before. He knew the boundaries. More importantly, he knew his rights. The first sign of trouble came within 8 minutes. A woman in a gray pantsuit approached from the direction of the elevator bank. Her heels clicked an aggressive staccato against the marble. Her face was arranged into an expression of practiced authority, the kind of look that usually makes people apologize reflexively. She stopped approximately 6 feet from Marcus and crossed her arms. "Quote 0, she demanded. Marcus kept his camera steady. "Quote 1, quote 2, quote 3. The woman's eyes narrowed. This was clearly not the response she expected. In her world, challenges to authority were supposed to wither under the weight of her disapproval. Marcus remained calm, almost clinical in his demeanor. He had learned that emotional reactions served no purpose in these encounters. The camera captured everything. The truth would speak for itself. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," she said, her voice hardening. "I'm not going to do that, ma'am. I haven't violated any laws. I passed through security. I'm permitted to be here." "We'll see about that." She turned and marched away, her heels now beating an even more aggressive rhythm. Marcus watched her go, knowing exactly what would happen next. She would find a security officer, she would make a complaint, and then the real confrontation would begin. Think about this moment for a second. Here is a man, alone, armed with nothing but a camera and his knowledge of the law, facing down the weight of federal bureaucracy. Most people in this situation would simply leave. They would assume the authority figure must be correct. They would internalize the message that they do not belong, that they are somehow in the wrong. But Marcus understood something crucial. The Constitution does not only protect you when it is convenient for those in power, it protects you precisely when it is inconvenient for them. Less than 3 minutes passed before a Federal Protective Service officer appeared at the end of the corridor. He was a stocky man with close-cropped hair and a bearing that suggested military background. His uniform was immaculate, his expression already set in lines of irritation. He walked with purpose toward Marcus, his hand resting casually near his belt. Not on his weapon, but close enough to send a message. "Sir, I need you to tell me what your business is here today." Marcus remained where he stood. "Good morning, officer. I'm exercising my First Amendment rights by filming in a publicly accessible area of this federal building." "That's not what I asked you. I asked what your official business is." "With respect, I don't believe I'm required to state any official business. I passed through security. I'm in a public area. I'm not interfering with anyone or anything." The officer's jaw tightened visibly. Quote 11. Quote 12. Quote 13. Quote 14. This is where the training often fails law enforcement. Many officers are taught to project authority and expect compliance. They are not always taught what to do when compliance does not materialize. The pause that followed Marcus's question stretched for several seconds, and in that silence, something shifted in the air between them. "Look," the officer said, his voice dropping to something between a threat and a warning. "I can make this very easy or very difficult for you. Your choice. I'm going to continue exercising my rights, officer. If you believe I've committed a crime, please tell me what it is. Otherwise, I'll continue what I'm doing." "You're disrupting federal operations. I'm standing in a public corridor with a camera. How exactly am I disrupting anything? People are complaining." "That's not a crime." "Officer, people being uncomfortable with lawful activity doesn't make that activity illegal." The officer's face flushed red. He clearly was not accustomed to this level of pushback. Most people folded immediately when confronted with federal authority. Most people assumed the uniform meant the person wearing it was automatically correct. Marcus knew better. He had studied the relevant regulations. He had memorized the key court decisions. He understood that knowledge was the only real protection any citizen had against the overreach of power. Quote 22, the officer said. Arts quote 23. Haas quote 24. Quote 25. Quote 26. The officer's hand moved closer to his radio. "I don't need to cite anything. This is federal property, and I'm responsible for security." "Actually, you do need to cite something. The regulations you're supposed to enforce, specifically Title 41 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 102-74, actually protect my right to be here and record. The 2019 DHS Memorandum explicitly states that photography and filming in publicly accessible areas of federal facilities is permitted, and that facility personnel should not interfere with lawful photography." Have you ever watched someone realize they have been outmaneuvered? There is a particular expression that crosses the face, a flicker of uncertainty followed by defensive hostility. The officer experienced this sequence visibly. His certainty had collided with Marcus's preparation, and the result was confusion masquerading as anger. He said, the standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for what happened next. Another figure appeared at the end of the corridor, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who outranks everyone in the room and knows it. This man wore a dark suit rather than a uniform. His badge hung from a lanyard around his neck. His expression was calm, almost curious, as he approached the confrontation. Quote, 33, he asked. The uniformed officer turned with visible relief. Quote, 34. The man in the suit looked at Marcus for a long moment, studying him without judgment. Then he turned back to the officer. Quote, 35, quote, 36, quote, 37, quote, 38, quote, 39, quote, 40, quote, 41. The officer fell silent. The question hung in the air like an accusation. The man in the suit extended his hand toward Marcus. Marcus shook the offered hand. Quote, 43. Agent Crawford nodded slowly. Quote, Quote 45. Quote 46. Quote 47. Agent Crawford turned to the uniformed officer. His expression remained neutral, but something in his tone shifted toward what could only be described as professional correction. The uniformed officer looked as if he had been struck. His entire framework for understanding this encounter had just collapsed. He had been so certain of his authority, so confident in his ability to dictate terms, and now his own supervisor was dismantling that certainty piece by piece. Quote 51. Agent Crawford continued, turning back to Marcus. Zatzer, quote 52. And just like that, it was over. Marcus thanked Agent Crawford and remained in the building for another 45 minutes, filming without further incident. The uniformed officer retreated to his post, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and resentment. The woman in the gray pantsuit never reappeared. The building continued its daily operations, and somewhere in the background, Marcus's camera recorded every moment. But here is what makes this incident truly significant. It was not just about one auditor winning one confrontation. It was about the system working the way it was designed to work. Agent Crawford understood the regulations. He understood constitutional protections. And he was willing to correct a subordinate who had strayed from those principles. This is what accountability looks like. Not punishment for the sake of punishment, but education and correction within the chain of command. If you are finding value in these stories, I want you to know there are more like this waiting for you. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in Marcus's position. Would you have stood your ground? Would you have left at the first sign of conflict? And if you want to see more content exploring these critical moments where authority meets accountability, make sure you are subscribed. The next two incidents we are about to explore will make this one look like a polite disagreement. Now let us travel to a stretch of highway in Connecticut on an evening in late May 2014. The Connecticut Turnpike stretches like a gray ribbon through the dense suburban landscape, carrying thousands of vehicles daily between the major cities of the Northeast. On most evenings, it is simply a conduit, a means of getting from one place to another with minimal thought. But on the evening of May 28, 2014, a section of this highway near Westbrook became the stage for a confrontation that would ripple through law enforcement circles for months afterward. Detective Victor Sandoval had been working undercover operations for the Hartford County Sheriff's Department for nearly 7 years. He was good at his job, perhaps too good. The work had taught him to move through the world differently than most people, to see threats in shadows, to trust his instincts above all else. On this particular evening, he was driving an unmarked Dodge Charger wearing plain clothes, conducting surveillance on a suspected drug trafficking operation. What he did not know was that a series of carjackings over the previous 2 weeks had put every law enforcement officer in the region on edge. The pattern was disturbing. Criminals posing as plainclothes police officers had been conducting fake traffic stops, pulling over vehicles, and robbing the occupants at gunpoint. 3 incidents in 12 days. The state police had issued warnings. Patrol officers were instructed to be extremely cautious about any unidentified individuals conducting stops, especially those in unmarked vehicles without proper identification. Detective Sandoval was aware of the warnings in a general sense. He had heard about the carjackings through department channels, but the connection between those incidents and his own work did not register as he pulled his unmarked car behind a silver Honda Accord on the shoulder of the turnpike. His target was a person of interest in the trafficking investigation. The stop was legitimate law enforcement activity. Everything was proceeding according to his training. What Sandoval did not see was the Connecticut State Police cruiser that had been traveling in the opposite direction, its trooper observing through the median divide, an unmarked vehicle executing what appeared to be an unauthorized traffic stop. Trooper Daniel Kowalski had 11 years on the force. He had worked highways, worked narcotics, worked community policing in some of the state's roughest neighborhoods. He knew the look of legitimate law enforcement activity, and he knew the look of something suspicious. What he was observing fell into the second category: an unmarked vehicle, no visible emergency lights, a driver in casual clothing approaching a stopped car. This was exactly what the carjackers had been doing. Exactly. Kowalski executed a U-turn at the next crossover and approached the scene with his lights activated. His hand rested on his service weapon. His training told him to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. He positioned his cruiser at an angle behind the unmarked Charger, creating a tactical advantage while blocking potential escape routes. Detective Sandoval heard the siren before he saw the cruiser. His first thought was annoyance. He was in the middle of a sensitive operation, and now some uniform was about to blow his cover. He turned from the Honda Accord and started walking toward the state police vehicle, his badge in his hand, ready to identify himself and send this interruption on its way. What happened next would become the subject of departmental investigations, official complaints, and extensive media coverage. Trooper Kowalski had exited his cruiser with his weapon drawn, positioned behind his door, using it as cover. His voice cut through the evening air like a blade. There was no negotiation in his tone. This was a command backed by the authority of life and death. Sandoval froze. For a fraction of a second, his training warred with his ego. He was a decorated detective. He had worked alongside state police officers dozens of times. The idea that one of them was pointing a weapon at him was almost incomprehensible. Quote 54, "For sac suicide," he shouted back. Quote 50. Quote 56, "Here is a moment where everything could have gone catastrophically wrong. Two law enforcement officers, both armed, both operating under different sets of assumptions, both certain they were in the right." Sandoval's mind was racing through possibilities. Was this trooper unstable? Had he not heard the identification? Why was he not standing down? What Sandoval could not know was that Trooper Kowalski had heard this exact claim before. Not personally, but through training scenarios and real-world reports. Criminals posing as police often claimed to be law enforcement when confronted. They knew the terminology. They carried fake badges. They could sound completely convincing right up until the moment they opened fire on whoever was foolish enough to believe them. "I said hands up. I'm not telling you again." Sandoval's badge hit the ground. His hands went up. Rage boiled in his chest. But some deeper instinct, the one that had kept him alive through years of dangerous work, told him this was not the moment to push back. The trooper's finger was on the trigger. The math was simple and terrifying. "Turn around. Face away from me. Interlace your fingers behind your head. This is insane. I'm a police officer. My credentials are in my... I don't care what's in your pocket. Turn around now." Sandoval complied. He turned. He interlaced his fingers. He stood on the shoulder of the Connecticut Turnpike, a detective with 7 years of undercover experience, being treated like a criminal by a fellow officer. The humiliation burned like acid. But underneath the humiliation, something else was beginning to surface. A cold, analytical understanding of exactly what was happening. Trooper Kowalski approached carefully, weapon still drawn, every movement deliberate. He was following protocol to the letter. Unknown individual in plainclothes conducting what appeared to be an unauthorized traffic stop. Claims of law enforcement status unverified. The carjacking warnings were screaming in his mind. He was not going to be the next officer killed because he trusted a badge he could not authenticate. "What department did you say?" "Hartford County Sheriff, Undercover Operations. My credentials are in my left inside jacket pocket." "Don't reach for anything." "I'm not reaching. I'm telling you where they are." Kowalski moved closer, close enough to conduct a search. He patted down Sandoval's jacket, located the credential case, and extracted it carefully. He stepped back before examining it, maintaining distance, maintaining tactical advantage. The credentials were legitimate. The photograph matched. The badge was genuine Hartford County Sheriff's Department issue. Kowalski lowered his weapon but did not holster it. "Why didn't you identify yourself properly?" Sandoval turned slowly, his hand still partially raised. "I was identifying myself. I had my badge in my hand. I told you I was on the job. You were conducting what looked like an unauthorized stop on an unmarked vehicle. We've had 3 carjackings in 2 weeks. Criminals pretending to be cops. I know about the carjackings. I'm not a carjacker. I'm a decorated detective conducting a legitimate investigation. How am I supposed to know that from 200 feet away?" This question hung in the air between them. It was not rhetorical. It was the fundamental issue at the heart of this entire encounter. How is one officer supposed to distinguish legitimate law enforcement activity from criminal impersonation? How do you protect the public from fake cops without treating real cops like criminals? What do you think should have happened here? Two officers, both doing their jobs, both following their training, ended up in a standoff that could have turned deadly. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Was the trooper right to draw his weapon? Was the detective right to be outraged? There are no easy answers, but the conversation matters. Before the two officers could resolve their disagreement, another vehicle arrived on the scene. A Hartford County Sheriff's Department supervisor, Sergeant Michael Chen, had been monitoring radio traffic and recognized the developing situation. He pulled his marked cruiser behind Kowalski's position and stepped out with his hands visible, his badge prominently displayed. "Everyone take a breath," Chen said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had mediated dozens of similar conflicts. "Trooper, I'm Sergeant Chen, Hartford County. That's my detective you've got at gunpoint." Kowalski finally holstered his weapon. "Your detective was conducting what looked like an unauthorized stop. Plain clothes, unmarked vehicle, no visible identification. We've had a string of... I know about the carjackings. I also know Detective Sandoval has been working this investigation for 3 months. He should have been more careful about identification, but you also need to understand the position you've put him in." Sandoval stepped forward, his composure cracked, but not broken. "The position I've been put in, I had my badge out, identified myself verbally. He had his weapon pointed at my face. And if I'd assumed every plainclothes individual claiming to be a cop was actually telling the truth," Kowalski responded, "I could be dead right now. My partner could be dead. Civilians could be dead." Sergeant Chen raised both hands. "Both of you stop. You're both right and you're both wrong. That's the situation. Detective Sandoval, you should have had proper lights on your vehicle when conducting a stop. Your identification should have been immediate and unambiguous. Trooper Kowalski, once the detective identified himself verbally and produced his badge, the level of force should have been reassessed." "He produced his badge after I gave commands," Kowalski said. "Until I verified those credentials, he was an unknown threat. And I could have been shot because some troopers can't tell the difference between a carjacker and a decorated detective," Sandoval shot back. "Enough." Chen's voice hardened. Quote 82. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken resentment. Neither officer wanted to concede anything. Neither wanted to admit that the other might have had legitimate reasons for their actions. But Sergeant Chen was right. The system had worked, ugly and confrontational as it was. The trooper had identified a potential threat and responded according to protocol. The detective had been temporarily inconvenienced, but not harmed. The investigation would sort out the details. What happened in the weeks following this incident reveals something important about how law enforcement handles internal conflicts. The Connecticut State Police conducted a formal review of Trooper Kowalski's actions. Their conclusion: he had followed proper procedure given the information available to him at the time. The carjacking warnings had created a heightened threat environment. His response was proportionate to that threat. The Hartford County Sheriff's Department also conducted a review. Their conclusion: Detective Sandoval should have used proper lighting when conducting traffic stops, even in undercover capacity. His identification process, while technically adequate, did not meet the heightened standards required during a period of police impersonation crimes. Neither officer was disciplined. Both were counseled. The incident became a training example, used in academies across the region to illustrate the complexities of interagency encounters. The state police superintendent issued a statement supporting his troopers' actions while acknowledging that improved communication between departments could prevent similar incidents. But here is what got lost in the official reports and the bureaucratic language. Two men who should have been allies found themselves in a life-threatening confrontation because the system had created impossible conditions. The criminals posing as police had poisoned the well of trust. Every legitimate officer now operated under a cloud of suspicion. Every citizen pulled over by a plainclothes officer had reason to wonder if they were about to be robbed. The carjackers had not just stolen property, they had stolen something far more valuable. They had stolen the assumption of legitimacy that makes law enforcement possible. Detective Sandoval continued his work with the Hartford County Sheriff's Department, but colleagues noted he was never quite the same after the incident. The experience of having a fellow officer's weapon pointed at his face had shaken something loose in his understanding of his profession. He had always believed that the badge meant something, that it conferred automatic recognition and respect among those who wore it. That belief had been shattered on the shoulder of the Connecticut Turnpike. Trooper Kowalski received commendations for his handling of the situation. His superiors praised his adherence to protocol, his refusal to make assumptions that could have proven fatal, but in quiet moments, he wondered about the alternative. What if his suspicion had been wrong in a different way? What if he had not drawn his weapon, and the plainclothes individual had actually been a carjacker? What if the next time he hesitated because of this incident, someone died? These are the questions that haunt officers in the aftermath of tense encounters. There are no clean answers. Every decision carries potential consequences in both directions. Draw too fast and you might harm an innocent person. Draw too slow and you might not go home to your family. The weight of that calculation is difficult for civilians to fully understand, but it is the constant companion of everyone who wears a badge. The final incident we are about to explore is different from the first two. It does not involve a quick resolution or a clear vindication. It involves a 5-hour detention, a jurisdictional nightmare, and questions about sovereignty, authority, and civil rights that remain unresolved to this day. If you have made it this far, you are clearly someone who appreciates depth and complexity in these stories. Make sure you are subscribed because what comes next is unlike anything else we have covered. Let us travel to Montana, to a desolate stretch of road that most Americans have never heard of, on a cold morning in October 2022. The landscape of north-central Montana is a study in contrast. Rolling plains stretch toward distant mountain ranges, the sky so vast it seems to press down on the earth with physical weight. This is country where you can drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle, where the nearest town might be 40 miles away, where the boundary between civilization and wilderness feels thin and permeable. It is also country where multiple jurisdictions intersect in ways that create profound legal complexity. Federal land managed by the Bureau of Land Management sits adjacent to state territory, which borders the Fort Kearny Indian Reservation, which contains both reservation land and deeded property that belongs to individual owners. The boundaries are not always clearly marked. The rules that apply in one location may not apply 50 feet away. For most people, this complexity is irrelevant. They pass through without knowing or caring whose authority they are under. For Conservation Officer Lucas Brennan of the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, this complexity was about to become the defining experience of his career. Brennan had been a game warden for nearly 12 years. He knew this territory intimately, knew where the elk herds moved during different seasons, knew which ranchers could be trusted, and which had reputations for looking the other way when illegal hunting occurred on their land. He also knew that tensions between the state wildlife department and the Fort Kearny tribal authorities had been escalating for months. The issue was elk poaching. State investigators believed that individuals associated with the reservation were killing elk on state land without proper licenses, then retreating to tribal territory where state officers had no jurisdiction to pursue. The tribal authorities denied this, claimed the state was using conservation enforcement as a pretext for harassment, and demanded that any investigation be conducted through proper tribal channels. Negotiations between the two governments had broken down repeatedly. A proposed memorandum of understanding had been rejected. Distrust festered on both sides. Brennan was aware of all this as he drove his marked patrol vehicle along County Road 47 on the morning of October 14th. The road ran through a section of deeded land, property that was technically within the boundaries shown on tribal maps, but was legally owned by individual landowners and subject to Montana state law. This distinction would become the central issue of everything that followed. He was conducting routine patrol, checking for hunting violations in an area known for illegal activity. His vehicle displayed the official markings of the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. His uniform was properly worn, his credentials current, his authority unquestionable under state law. What he did not expect was to find that authority challenged in the most fundamental way possible. The first sign of trouble appeared in his rear-view mirror. A white SUV with tribal police markings was approaching rapidly from behind. Brennan pulled slightly to the side of the road, expecting the vehicle to pass. Instead, it activated its emergency lights and pulled in behind him. Brennan's initial reaction was confusion. He was not speeding. He had not violated any traffic laws. His vehicle was properly marked and registered. Why would tribal police be stopping him? He rolled down his window and waited. Two officers approached, one on each side of his vehicle. Their body language was tense, aggressive. This was not a friendly encounter between colleagues. Quote, 83, the officer on his left said. It was not a request. Quote, 84. Quote, 85. Brennan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He understood immediately what was happening. This was not about any traffic violation. This was about the ongoing jurisdictional dispute, about the elk poaching investigation, about the breakdown in relations between the tribal government and the state. He was being sent a message, he said, keeping his voice calm. The officers exchanged glances. Whatever they had expected from this encounter, it was not a game warden who understood the legal complexities as well as they did, but they had their orders, and they were not going to back down. Quote 90. Brennan made a decision that would define the next several hours of his life. He stepped out of his vehicle, not because he agreed with their authority, but because resistance at this point would only escalate a situation that was already dangerously unstable. He would document everything. He would assert his rights verbally, and he would let the legal system sort out the consequences. What followed was an ordeal that stretched across 5 hours and 23 minutes. The tribal officers detained Brennan on the side of the road, claiming he had violated the tribal resolution and would need to appear before tribal court to retrieve his vehicle. They called for a tow truck. They called for additional officers. They called for tribal officials who could supposedly authorize the detention. Brennan stood in the October cold watching the machinery of bureaucratic power grind forward, knowing that every action being taken was legally questionable and possibly unconstitutional. He was a state officer on state-accessible roads, being detained by tribal authorities who had no criminal allegation against him. The absurdity of the situation was matched only by its seriousness. He said to the lead tribal officer, a man who had identified himself as Sergeant Wayne Crowfoot. Quote 92, quote 93 is quote 94. Crowfoot shrugged. Quote 95, quote 96, quote 97. This circular logic was impenetrable. Every assertion of rights was met with reference to a process that had no legitimate authority to address the situation. It was Kafkaesque in the truest sense, a system that acknowledged no external standards, no constitutional limitations, no rule of law beyond its own pronouncements. A Blaine County Sheriff's deputy arrived approximately 90 minutes into the detention. Deputy Sarah Whitehorse assessed the situation with visible discomfort. She was caught between competing authorities, tribal police who operated under different rules, and a state officer who was clearly being held against his will without legitimate cause. "Lucas, you okay?" she asked, keeping her distance from the tribal officers. "I'm being illegally detained, Sarah. I'm on a county road through deeded property. They're claiming a tribal resolution gives them authority to hold me and seize my vehicle." Whitehorse looked at Sergeant Crowfoot. "Is this really how we want to handle this?" "He violated the resolution. We're following procedure. He's a state officer on a public road without any criminal allegation. How is this following procedure?" The tribal council was very clear. All state officers must request permission before entering reservation rights of way. He didn't request permission. Because he doesn't need permission, this is a county road. Crowfoot's expression hardened. Quote 105. Deputy Whitehorse stepped back, clearly recognizing that she had no authority to intervene. The tribal police were operating within their own framework, one that did not acknowledge the constraints she understood as fundamental to her profession. She could witness, she could report, but she could not stop what was happening. Quote 106. Quote 107. The hours crawled by. More tribal officials arrived. Harold Blackwater, the tribal fish and game director, appeared to lecture Brennan about respecting sovereign boundaries. George Whitebull, described as the vice president of the tribal council, arrived to assert the legitimacy of the tribal resolution. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Brennan would assert his rights under state and federal law. The tribal officials would respond with references to tribal sovereignty and internal resolutions. Neither side acknowledged the validity of the other's position. "What you don't seem to understand," White Bull said at one point, his tone condescending, "is that this land has belonged to our people since before Montana was a state. Your laws are written on paper. Our authority comes from something deeper." "I respect the history and the sovereignty of your nation," Brennan replied. "What I don't respect is using that sovereignty to unlawfully detain a state officer who is legally authorized to be on this road. If you have a dispute with the state of Montana about jurisdictional boundaries, there are proper channels for that. Holding me hostage is not one of them. You're not being held hostage. You're being asked to comply with tribal law. Tribal law that cannot legally apply to me. I'm a non-tribal member. I'm not on reservation land. I'm on a public road through deeded property. The Tribal Council has determined that all rights-of-way within the reservation boundaries are subject to tribal regulation. That determination doesn't have legal force over non-tribal members conducting state business on public roads. We can have this argument for the next 12 hours, and the answer will be the same." At the 4-hour mark, a tow truck arrived. Brennan watched as his marked state patrol vehicle was hooked up and prepared for removal. The symbolism was unmistakable. This was not just about one officer and one detention. This was about power, about territory, about who had the authority to say what happened within disputed borders. "You're telling me," Brennan said slowly, "that I have to appear in tribal court, a court with no jurisdiction over me, to retrieve my state vehicle, which you're seizing without legal authority." "That's correct. And you don't see how that's fundamentally unconstitutional? I see a state officer who violated tribal law and is facing the consequences. There was no law violated. There was a resolution passed by a body with no authority over me. Those are not the same thing." The tow truck departed with Brennan's vehicle. He stood on the side of the road 5 hours into an unlawful detention, watching his primary tool for doing his job disappear down the highway. The tribal officers eventually provided him transportation to the edge of what they considered reservation territory and released him with a summons to appear in tribal court. Brennan walked the remaining distance to the nearest town, processed what had happened, and immediately began the documentation process that would lead to formal complaints, legal consultations, and an investigation that remains ongoing. This story does not have a clean resolution. The jurisdictional questions raised by Brennan's detention are part of a much larger conflict between tribal sovereignty and state authority that has been litigated for decades and will continue to be litigated for decades more. There are legitimate arguments on both sides. Tribal nations have genuine sovereignty that must be respected. State officers have constitutional rights that cannot be arbitrarily suspended. Where these principles collide, there are no easy answers. What we can say is that what happened to Lucas Brennan represents something troubling about the exercise of power, whether tribal or state, whether federal or local. Authority that operates without accountability tends toward abuse. The tribal officials who detained Brennan may have believed they were defending their sovereignty, but in doing so, they violated fundamental principles of due process and civil rights that apply regardless of jurisdictional boundaries. Brennan eventually retrieved his vehicle through a combination of legal pressure and diplomatic negotiation. The tribal court summons was never enforced. The proposed memorandum of understanding between the state and the tribal government remains unsigned. The elk poaching investigation that may have precipitated the entire incident continues without meaningful cooperation between the two jurisdictions. And somewhere in north-central Montana, a game warden continues his patrols, knowing that every time he drives through disputed territory, he could be stopped again. He could be detained again. He could have his vehicle seized again, because the underlying issues have not been resolved. The competing claims to authority have not been reconciled. The wound remains open. These three incidents, separated by geography and circumstance but united by theme, reveal something essential about the nature of power in America. It is not monolithic. It is not uniform. It is a patchwork of competing authorities, overlapping jurisdictions, and conflicting rules that create endless opportunities for confrontation. In the first incident, we saw what happens when knowledge of the law meets ignorance of the law. Marcus Webb understood his rights. The officer confronting him did not. The resolution came through the intervention of someone with greater authority and better understanding. The system worked, but only because the right person happened to be present at the right moment. In the second incident, we saw what happens when protocol meets ego. Both Trooper Kowalski and Detective Sandoval were doing their jobs according to their training. The conflict arose not from malice, but from incompatible procedures and a breakdown in communication between departments. The resolution was bureaucratic rather than substantive. The underlying tensions remained. In the third incident, we saw what happens when competing sovereignties refuse to acknowledge each other's legitimacy. Conservation Officer Brennan and the Fort Kearny Tribal Police were operating from entirely different legal frameworks. Neither was willing or able to recognize the validity of the other's position. The resolution, such as it was, came through pressure and negotiation rather than through any principled determination of who was right. What do these stories tell us? Perhaps they tell us that power is more fragile than it appears. The officers who confronted Marcus Webb believed their authority was absolute. They discovered it was contingent. Detective Sandoval believed his badge would be automatically recognized. He discovered that recognition must be earned. The Fort Kearny Tribal Police believed their resolution had legal force. They discovered that force exists on a spectrum from legitimate to questionable to indefensible. Perhaps they tell us that knowledge is the great equalizer. In each incident, the person who understood the relevant law, the relevant procedure, the relevant boundaries was better equipped to navigate the confrontation. Marcus Webb knew the DHS memorandum. Trooper Kowalski knew the carjacking protocols. Lucas Brennan knew the difference between reservation land and deeded property. Knowledge did not prevent the confrontations, but it shaped how they unfolded. Perhaps they tell us that accountability remains the exception rather than the rule. Special Agent Crawford held his subordinate accountable for overstepping. That was rare. The institutional investigations that followed the Connecticut Highway incident produced counseling rather than consequences. The detention of Lucas Brennan led to no formal sanctions for anyone involved. When power is challenged, the system often protects itself rather than admitting fault. The question I want to leave you with is this. What would you have done in any of these situations? Would you have stood your ground like Marcus Webb, armed with nothing but your knowledge and your camera? Would you have drawn your weapon like Trooper Kowalski, unwilling to make assumptions that might cost your life? Would you have complied under protest like Lucas Brennan, choosing documentation over confrontation? There are no wrong answers. Each person must navigate these situations according to their own circumstances, their own risk tolerance, their own assessment of the people and powers they face. But one thing is certain: understanding your rights, understanding the limits of authority, understanding the complex web of jurisdictions and regulations that govern American life. This understanding is the foundation of effective citizenship. Power does not give up easily. Those who wield it rarely welcome questions about its boundaries. The officers who told Marcus Webb he could not film did not want to be educated about DHS memoranda. The detective who faced a drawn weapon did not want to hear about carjacking protocols. The tribal officials who detained Lucas Brennan did not want to discuss the limits of their sovereignty, but the questions must be asked. The boundaries must be tested. The assumption that authority is always legitimate must be challenged, because when it goes unchallenged, when citizens simply accept whatever they are told by whoever wears a badge, the space for abuse expands without limit. These three incidents ended without tragedy. Marcus Webb continued his auditing work. Detective Sandoval returned to his investigations. Lucas Brennan eventually recovered his vehicle and resumed his patrols. But we know, all of us know, that similar confrontations have ended differently. We know that misunderstandings, ego, jurisdictional confusion, and the simple human tendency to escalate can produce outcomes that cannot be undone. The officers in these stories were humbled, their assumptions were challenged, their authority was questioned, and in each case, someone with greater knowledge or greater rank stepped in to provide a different perspective. This is how the system is supposed to work. But it does not always work this way. Sometimes there is no Special Agent Crawford to intervene. Sometimes there is no Sergeant Chen to mediate. Sometimes there is no resolution at all, just power exercised without accountability, consequences imposed without justification, and citizens left to wonder what their rights actually mean in practice. So I ask you again, what would you have done? What will you do when your moment comes? Because for all of us, eventually, there will be a moment, a traffic stop that feels wrong, a request that seems unreasonable, a demand that exceeds what the law actually requires. In that moment, everything you know, everything you have learned, everything you believe about your place in this society will be tested. I hope these stories have given you something to think about. I hope they have expanded your understanding of how power operates and how it can be challenged. And I hope, when your moment comes, you will be ready. If you found value in this video, if these stories resonated with you, then subscribe to this channel and join the community of people who believe that understanding matters. Leave a comment telling me which of these 3 incidents affected you most. Tell me what you would have done differently or what you think should have happened. The conversation continues in the comments, and I read every single one. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and never stop asking questions about the power that shapes your life. Because when authority goes unquestioned, the only people who suffer are those without the knowledge to push back.